Hello, and welcome to the Intergenerational Solidarity Series, a podcast sponsored by the Civic Forum, Inuka Kenya Nisisi, and The Elephant. I'm Darius Okola, here with episode 2 of the podcast about a national descent that came to collectively be known as the Gen Z series. This time, I'm with the foremost gentleman, senior counsel, journalist, former member of parliament, politician, and human rights defender. He has served in and out of government, and his experiences and tales have crucial insights that will be very, very helpful to the Gen Zs as they try to forge new models and new tools for fighting for their human rights. Karibu sana.
Thank you very much and welcome. I'm glad that you are doing this series because those who don't learn from history tend to repeat it with the consequences that are dire.
True.
And we face critical moments in our history in the light of what became of the Gen Z's revolt of June last year.
Yeah. So just looking at it, these younger people find themselves in a very interesting space. They went out to the streets, they agitated both online and offline. And one of the key elements of just how it has played out is the fact that this is not a new thing. As a country, we've had series and series of these kinds of agitation by young people. And I would say, if you indulge me, when you were young, at their age, you had these kind of political moments. But just stepping a bit back, what are some of the key elements in your journey, in your career, and in your own convictions that made you want to be out there to fight for people and to fight for a fair and a prosperous civic public?
It's interesting the way you describe the events that preceded the Gen Z generation, because if we contextualize the events of June last year against the history of this country, you see that it was not totally unprecedented, and it's been a history of betrayal right from day one of independence. And you've got to go back to the Lancaster House negotiations and the agreements that were reached and the constitution that was agreed to, that we have kind of reincorporated under the 2010 constitution, which brought multi-party or constitutionalized multi-party democracy in our country. And you see it has been a history of betrayal. If you look at the struggle for independence, those who struggled, led by Dedan Kimathi, never benefited or were never given an opportunity to run the country on the lines on which they had fought for independence. So that at independence, the British government had been able, as an imperial power, as a colonial power, to bring back the colonial rule under the so-called Home Guards, who took over, which I refer to as the first betrayal. And then the history of that was a history of dismantling of the first constitution, the enactment of the single-party era that had introduced Section 2A of the repealed constitution that outlawed all multi-parties, and then the struggle to repeal that Section 2A, led by the Forum for Restoration of Democracy group, which I think you will see in the context of our history is the nearest to Gen Z. And if you look at what became of Ford and put it in the context of Kenyan history, you will not be surprised And the danger and the challenge, therefore, is what lessons do we learn from our history so that the younger generation do not repeat the mistakes that have been made, or if not mistakes, what lessons can they learn from our history? So for me, the younger generation, or the generation that is represented by the Gen Zs, need to step back now that they are not on the streets and look at our history, and then how to avoid the pitfalls that, for example, we went through in Ford. Because if you look at the history of Ford, the splinter from Ford to Ford Kenya and Ford Asili, and later on the emergence of the Mwai Kibaki regime, which took advantage of the split within Ford to bring Kibaki to State House at the elections of 2000 and 2003, and change the personalities and the events. You see we are following the exact trajectory that saw Mwai Kibaki being declared an Ametosha. So it's a period in which you need to take stock and work on ways of avoiding these mistakes or learning lessons from the past. To me, the Gen Z's revolution that aborted is not over, because if there are any lessons to learn, then it only means that the next course of action will push the regime to understand that it no longer represents the wishes of the Kenyan people. It no longer represents the vision that is set out in the 2010 constitution that we fought so hard for, because that is where we need to go back to. Because unless we do that, then all the struggles that led to the enactment, the prorogation of the 2010 constitution will be lost, and we'll be going back to the one-party era.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Senior, just looking at the fact that every generation sort of is rediscovering this clamor for freedom, expansion of freedom and independence and rule of law. But the script is as old and as skewed as it's been. Now, they have to go back and begin to interact with our history. One of the key sort of challenges is where to find this history. Is there, what are some of the elements that are within reach for a young person who wants to understand this history? Is there a repository? Should we put it back in the schooling system? How would you say we go about ensuring that our history, like many other countries do, is central to our national narrative, but also in the everyday existences? How do we do that so that the Gen Zs can have these tools to deal with what they're confronting? Yeah.
I understand what you say, because I've had the benefit of traveling extensively out of Kenya. And when I look at, for example, the history of the ANC in South Africa, and what happened after Mandela became president of the new Republic of South Africa, one of the things that they actively pursued was to make the history of South Africa and its history of the freedom of the struggle for to end apartheid part of their DNA, so that every kid growing up knew about the ANC, what the ANC fought for. And when they got the new constitution that ended apartheid era, they continued teaching their history. It's the same in the United States of America, which has the oldest constitution in the world. If you go there, you'd find that there were Independence Days that celebrate the heroes of the Constitution. To the contrary, in Kenya, we suppress our history. It's like that. It's like we are uncomfortable telling our history, telling the story of Kenya's independence. So that even during the Independence Days, you don't hear a mention of Dedan Kimathi. You hear about the Kapenguria Six as if they were the beginning and the end of our struggle for independence. Kids born in the 80s, 90s do not know what the second liberation was all about. So the challenge is how to get the Ministry of Education to alter the curriculum so that it includes lessons of our history right from the basic education level all the way to the university. Because if we don't know that, if we don't do that, then we are bound to repeat the mistakes of the past, and the lessons are dire, because what it means is that we lose the basic freedoms that we fought for and entrench authoritarianism, which was the reason for enacting the new constitution, to make the vision entrenched therein of enjoying the fundamental rights as rights and not privileges of the ruling class, or whoever happens to be a state house, or whichever political party is in power. These are not privileges, and I think what the Gen Zs demonstrated in June last year was that efforts to get people to assert their rights are not dead. It's only that we discourage, we seem to suppress. So we need, for example, during our national days, to remind the young people that where we have come from, when they are publishing the honors that is present at the State House on Madaraka Day or Jamhuri Day, we need to see a representation of the people responsible not only for the first liberation, but second liberation, and now the third liberation, which we are going through. So yes, we have to actively remember to remind our children and the children that come after them of the struggles that led to the enjoyment of the freedoms that we are proud of today, that make us so special as a country compared to others, for example, in the region.
Yeah, but that's interesting, because part of your career is in journalism, and you publish regularly the platform, Nairobi Law Monthly Review. There was even when this Clemmer started, there was the Mwakenya movement back in the day. And now what we are seeing with the Gen Zs is they were in the physical streets, but they've also done quite a bit of work in the digital streets, if we can call it that. With the benefit of both experience and hindsight, how much would you say is the critical nature of what they're doing, especially in the digital streets, to drive these freedoms? How would you situate it, having had the advantage of being a man of the pen before we had this privilege of mobile phones and the social media?
I think what you're calling the digital street is really citizen journalism, because journalism now has become instant. The era of censorship is long gone, and that is why we're able to sing Kasongo, we're able to sing songs before the president that are critical of him. This is a sign of an active democratic society, and even the fact that the president can now accept that it's become part of his presidency is a sign that we are maturing as a democracy. I wouldn't criticize those who are seeing the means of protest through the available online discussions, because they don't cost any money. All you need is a smartphone, and you're able to reach thousands, if not millions. Number two, we are no longer an island. More used to talk about us being an island of peace, surrounded by,
the sea of trouble.
Authoritarianism. Now what goes on in Washington is read instantaneously when Donald Trump calls a press conference or addresses American issues. We see their relevance immediately, which takes me back even to our days in the second liberation. What was happening, for example, the collapse of the Soviet Union. We were seeing this live on CNN and others, and that encouraged us to rise against the one-party regime and insist that we are no longer an island, and what's the worldwide movement for freedom was worldwide, and the world had become a village, and therefore the events in the former Soviet Union or the breach of the Berlin Wall were alive, and we could see we could do the same by simply asserting our rights to exercise freedom of speech, freedom of association, and to demonstrate that these were, they inhere to every human being, and they are not privileges that were granted to us by the authoritarian one-party state. So we have to come to terms with the fact that attempting to resist developments, communication developments taking place around us is an exercise in futility. And no question about it. Those who talk about the Gen Zs movement having died with the breakup or the betrayal of their movement at the critical hour when they were about to effect the most fundamental changes in Kenyan history, those who think that cannot happen are daydreamers, because the next time round, the lessons learned from June last year will not be repeated, and they will be happening spontaneously rather, in all parts of the country, and you cannot resist them by forming broad-based short-term government that does not represent the wishes or the will of the people.
Yeah, which is, it's an interesting element in terms of how it has evolved. This sense of betrayal, it was there in 65, going into 66. We saw it in the early 90s. Now it's happening to them. What are some of those salient moments? In light of this kind of betrayal, what is likely to evolve out of this? Where should the Gen Zs go?
Well, just they need to regroup. We need to rethink the methods, and we need to find allies. During our time, we could plead with the donor communities to stop aid because we were being punished for exercising the very basic rights that they were exercising in the United States or in the United Kingdom. We are behaving as human beings, sharing a common humanity. So now this has changed. So we need new tools for dealing with the demands of the times. And what the Gen Zs demonstrated is that use of communication, the means of communication that are available today, if properly utilized, act firstly as a very strong deterrent against authoritarian practices, and number two, they can actually effect changes even before elections come, which is what the Gen Zs almost succeeded in doing in June last year. And the mistake people like my friend Raila Odinga are doing is to think that by sheer exercise of the cultism that surrounds their names, they can hold back. They cannot, because a moment will come when the State House will become too hot even for William Ruto. And he has to, just like it became too hot for Daniel Arap Moi when he repealed Section 2A because of the demands of those of us who are in the second deliberation. So it's a matter of time. And I personally haven't given up on the Gen Zs.
Yeah, which is interesting because the other element I would love you to speak into is the different reactions from the elders to what the Gen Zs did. That those who are happy, they're like, okay, this is finally these young people are joining and becoming politically active. They're joining the civic public as active participants. There are those who reminisce. For those of you who were there in the 90s, you saw how this kind of dynamics play out. But then there are those who saw this as some kind of a disrespect. and they're built into, you know, respect the elders, even as much as these Gen Zs had,
Yeah,
you know,
that
genuine
culture,
grievances.
that culture of
Yeah.
respecting the elders is long, long gone, because now it is the elder that must respect, because the younger generation, because times have changed, and the methods of running not only families, communities, and the state, they are so fundamentally different from the time the elders ruled in the jurisdiction extended to the village, and therefore their authority stemmed from their respect to that within that village have long gone. Now children are being born far away from their villages. Children are growing up, going to schools where the cultural practices that defined their parents' generation are long gone. So we have to come to terms with that. And don't forget, these Gen Zs are not strangers. They live with us. We were giving them money to buy water. They were asking for money to buy a smartphone. And they were in the streets in full knowledge of their parents. The parents supported them. That's why they give them water to take when tear gassed. So those who think that this was a generation of youngsters that were misled are the ones, in fact, who are not reading history properly, because they had our complete support as their parents. If they didn't have a place to get back to in the evening, then they wouldn't have done what they did. So is that link between the parents and their sons and daughters who are on the streets on that during that period of June last year finally proved that we have come of age in terms of accepting that we live in a generation and in an environment that must respect a new culture, a culture based on the rule of law, a culture that traces its authority to a constitution like ours, the Constitution of 2010, and a culture and an environment in which we respect these basic values, like the very checks and balances that require the executive to obey court orders, that require the members of parliament to represent their interests rather than the interests of the president who is in office at the current time, and a culture that has ways and means of ending corruption. But we are seeing that instead of dealing with corruption head on, we're going around it as if it's not affecting society. If you trace what motivated, the immediate motivation for the Gen Z generation was the pervasive corruption here, where you get people rise from nowhere and start carrying bundles of cash and giving out without explaining their source, for example, without bothering to justify that hard work pays and there are shorter ways. You know, that is what seems to guide them. So the young people can see that unless we end that culture, we have no chance, despite qualifications that you may have. You may have the best qualifications, but when it comes to employment, if your qualifications are not going to help you secure a job, if your qualifications are not going to help you in shaping the future for your own children, then a rebellion is the result.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you've touched on politicians. Looking at how they've reacted over the last 8 months, there doesn't seem to exist any particular political program or political ideology guiding what they do. It's a very reactive kind of a model. Would you say with the current cluster of political class that we've literally reached the end of political imagination with this group?
Yeah, it's really disappointing to see the deeds and actions and the way of life that the beneficiaries of the 2010 Constitution are leading, because they do not represent the values that are contained in that document, the 2010 Constitution. They are actively undermining it, and this is obvious to everyone. So as time goes on, the reaction to this generation of politicians will be to throw them out. For example, and this has been a tradition of the Kenyan politics for a long time, every election leads to about 70% of parliamentarians losing their seats. That means now including the MCAs. Therefore, this continued disrespect for the Constitution, for which they have all sworn to defend and protect, the consequences are going to be that when an election is called, they are likely to be all swept away. So they may think that they succeeded in forestalling what was intended for by the Gen Z generation, because the period between now and 2027, when the elections are due, is very short, really short. And there is continued agitation for respect for rule of law. And we have got a class of judges now that are defending actively and taking risks to defend the Constitution and requiring that orders and judgments of the courts be respected. Of course, there will be within the judiciary elements that are corrupt, because as a result, for example, of the expansion of the judiciary after the 2010 Constitution, the number of members of the judiciary has increased more than tenfold. Therefore, cases of corruption are also magnified to the extent that we are now dealing with a much, much bigger membership of the judiciary than before 2010, when you could count the number of judges, for example, of the Court of Appeal, when we didn't have a Supreme Court. Now almost every county has a judge and many magistrates, both from the lowest class to the chief magistrate. Therefore, I am not really surprised that these accusations of corruption within the judiciary are being pinpointed or pointed out because it's a natural progression out of the expansion of the judiciary. And the judiciary is very much part of the Kenyan society. So when we talk about corruption, it's not just within the judiciary, it's corruption across the board in all arms of government. It's only that the judiciary gets on the spotlight because of the very nature of their job. We should focus more on the elected representatives, because they are the ones that are supposed to oversight these institutions, but they don't live by example. Therefore, the tendency to spotlight on, to put the judiciary on the spotlight is because that is what, for example, the judiciary and members of the National Assembly and Senate who want to shift away the focus from themselves by identifying an institution. But it's across the board, and I wouldn't personally say that the corruption is limited to judiciary, because we are seeing corruption everywhere within the three arms of government. We need to strengthen our institutions so that we can deal with the incidents of corruption. We need to reward judges and magistrates who take risks by convicting those who are charged with corruption. We need an office of the Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions that is sensitive to public demands and not to executive demands, which is the situation right now. The law is very clear, the institutions are in place, but we are not living a life in accordance with the Constitution. The entire Kenyan society needs to refocus and go back to the values that are enshrined in the 2010 Constitution.
Yeah, which is interesting. Still on institutions, both the formal and sort of the informal ones. In terms of the mechanisms in place right now, in your assessment, how robust are they in augmenting what the Gen Zs are doing. We're seeing what's happening with the IBC, a bit on the judiciary, some of the, should you say, the onslaught on the judiciary. The National Assembly is fairly, have not been up to expectations of the public mood, which informs part of the storming last year. What's your general assessment of all these institutions in the ability, one, to augment what these Gen Zs are doing, but also number two, in the build-up to the general elections that's coming?
Well, the institutions are very much in place. The Constitution contains our national values and principles. It sets out mechanisms for naming a government, for example. It sets mechanisms for vetting and appointing persons who hold public office. It contains principles of governance for public officers. So it's really a question of whether we can get a leadership at the executive level that respects the Constitution. And if you look back, not too far back, when Kibaki was sworn in and he spoke against corruption, policemen were being arrested by the Wananchi. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And for a short time we thought, finally, we are dealing with a beast, only to be disappointed because those who were elected didn't see the value of following up on what the president then was saying. So the challenge is getting leadership positions to those who believe in encouraging and nurturing a Kenyan society that respects rule of law. That's really the very minimum we must look for at the elections. Having said that, and you can see it now at the IEBC, the selection process itself, accusations have been made, strong accusations have been made against it as being flawed, because it plays such a critical role in ensuring that we have a leadership at the three levels of government that is qualified. But unless we have an IEBC that not just supervises elections, but that ensures candidates are duly qualified. You know, it's one thing to supervise elections, but it's quite another to allow candidates who shouldn't be allowed to run for office, who run contrary or who abuse the principles of the national values and principles set out in the Constitution. This is a special responsibility for the IEBC, and we need an IEBC that will enforce the provisions of the Constitution at that critical level of elections. Now, I don't see that happening anytime soon, but because the mechanisms are there, it's only a matter of time. And just like it took time to end the one-party era, it will take some time to get an IEBC in place that recognizes its role as not just supervising elections, but also for vetting candidates, so that we have candidates that are truly qualified running for office. Then it will start attracting people, men of honor, men who are not men and women who are not tainted by corruption, to seek public office. As it is now, the political space in Kenya is attractive to those who want to undermine the Constitution, not those who want to defend and protect it.
Yeah, and I mean, there's an interesting element coming out of it, and one hopes that all the initiatives that these young people, Gen Zs, have tried to do, which have to be channeled through the commission, that will come to fruition, including all the recalling MPs and their desire even to run. Because one of the interesting elements that we've seen over the years is the increasing number of young people who are into political participation, not just in voting, but also in terms of wanting to be in party politics and want to actively participate in that space all the way up to the election, as you mentioned. One of the other interesting elements that comes up is we are now a country where two or three are gathered, there is a chant. against the regime. It's an interesting kind of a society that has evolved out of June last year, and
I see it as I see the chants of Ruto must go, or singing of songs like Kasongo, Kaongo, Aende. This is a natural way of Gen Z is showing or demonstrating to those in power that use of raw power to end physical demonstrations will not end, because now the president will not go to any public place and address the crowds expecting that they will just be clapping, because they will not. They will tell him as it is. And therefore, that is a very strong, we talk about checks and balances. That is an important check on the executive. Abuse of power will be met by those chants, where the population perceive you as being corrupt. They'll tell you are corrupt or you must go. Where the executive or member of parliament does a good job, they will celebrate. I think we have reached that stage. And now it is up to the IEBC to ensure that those presenting themselves as candidates for elective office actually are qualified. Once you do that, Kenya can only get better. If we don't allow it to happen, we only go back to dark days where we have to force it to happen by sheer demands of the time.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think one last thing I'd love us to look at is where we are in terms of the socioeconomics. We went into some serious debt over the last decade, not much to account for it, which is part of why we've ended up with this kind of national dissent. In a sense, where we are, and with the benefit of having been in the lawmaking organ of the country, that also actively both in and outside of government over the last couple of years, what are some of those immediate elements we need to put in place to sort of shield Mwananchi? Because every day you go to the supermarket, it's new prices, and these younger people with starting out careers, barely much income, they're paying a critical price for that. What are our options in the immediate and maybe in the medium term to begin to get Wanjiku out of these kind of socioeconomic conditions?
Kenya is an amazing country with fantastic potential. And if we look at our country we are not, for example, as blessed with natural resources as some of our neighbors, but we are a country of great resilience. So once the fight against corruption takes root properly and is embedded in every move by those who vote for these people, because at the end of the day, they will always say, I was voted for, I was elected. So it's upon us, the electors, the voters, to ensure that we elect men and women whom we know will be able to perform their functions as per the Constitution. But we accept bribes. When you accept a bribe in order to vote for a particular candidate, then you are in no position to fight corruption. So the major issue of the day in Kenya today is a fight against corruption at all levels of society, in every institution. At the end of the day, it is upon us, it's up to you as an individual to play your part to end corruption. And just like it happened those days when members of the public were electing, not electing, but arresting corrupt police officers, we can get there. But we need a leadership that leads by example. A leadership that leads by bribes. And bribing means and includes going to a church and giving 20 million shillings and promising 100 million shillings without showing how it came into your hands, because we know how much you earn. We know the Constitution forbids you holding any other position. So it's incumbent upon you to tell us that, yes, I am able to generate businesses or income that enables me to go to a church and promise 100 million shillings without feeling that it is necessary for you to explain how you acquired it. You see, we need a leadership that leads by example. And once we reach there, the rest will follow almost as night follows the day.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So, I mean, what would be your final words to a young Gen Z lady or a young gent out there who's been part of this evolution all the way from April last year going into June and up to now, and who, in a sense, hasn't figured out where to go with this? What would be your words of
The
advice?
message is that not all is lost. What they achieved that day was more than has been achieved in decades. They were able to get the president to dissolve a cabinet and reconstitute it. What they have achieved has enabled the actions of forming governments to fight them. Because in the Constitution tells us a government that is not formed in accordance with this Constitution is unlawful.
Mm-hmm.
We need to just tell our youth, our Gen Z generation, not to think that they lost. They haven't lost. They came out much stronger, and they'll continue to gain strength, because even those who didn't know what they were fighting for now understand it. Those who thought that the heroes of the second liberation could not betray them now know that they can be betrayed, and that our best bet is in the Constitution. As they did when they demanded the right to demonstrate and the right to protest, those basic rights that are so basic, we need not keep reminding the regime or government in power that we're exercising these rights. They should be inborn, so that every person holding public office knows that they are holding it on behalf of the people, and the people can rise any time and tell you you must go. So they should not give up.
Yeah, Senior Counsel Gitobu Imanyara, always a pleasure.
Thank you very much, and it's been, you are welcome, and come back again and let's continue the discussion.
Sure.